Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, we're starting a brand new series about the history of political trials, the great political trials, the ones that shaped history. Everything from jury trials to military trials, from fair trials to witch hunts, from Socrates to Marine Le Pen. I mean, we're talking about a lot of different kinds of encounters in the courtroom that shaped and reshaped politics. But I want to start by explaining why we're doing this series, why I think this topic is so compelling and so revealing. I have, I think, seen in my life 2 executions, 3 people being executed, but 2 execution events, real executions, not imagined ones in films. But I'm not completely sure. You might think that someone would know whether they had actually seen a real execution. But the events that I'm thinking of were filmed, so we're talking about footage. In one case, TV camera, shaky, impromptu TV camera footage. In the other case, someone's mobile phone subversively recording the execution. And I have vivid images in my mind of some of the things on this film, this pair of videos, but I may have interpolated into those images the actual execution itself. I'm not completely sure, and I don't want to check. That is, I was thinking about it before I recorded this. I don't want to go online and Google the execution footage and start rummaging around in whatever parts of the internet that stuff circulates and gets probably celebrated, certainly pored over. So I'm relying on my memory here, but some of the images that I remember are very clear and I'm confident about them. The 2 events in question are, in the first place, the first one that I ever saw, the execution of the Ceausescus, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, the couple who ran Romania, communist Romania, a pair of murderous tyrants, no question. And they were executed on Christmas Day, 1989. The footage only emerged a few days later. This is pre-internet, so I must have seen it on TV. In fact, I'm pretty certain I must have seen it on the BBC. And instinctively, I feel the BBC wouldn't have shown the actual moment of death, but I can't be completely sure about that. I had a real interest in the Ceausescus because I had spent time, I was a student then, as a student travelling in Ceausescu's Romania, behind the Iron Curtain, and it was a really terrible place, truly terrible society. It was clear even to an occasional tourist like me that something had gone horribly wrong. It was almost like a parody of a society. And their deaths, which came at the end of the series of revolutions, mainly non-violent, mainly in their way peaceful, that brought about the end of communist rule in Eastern Europe, felt like a kind of culmination. And for many people, the crowning moment of that series of revolutions, particularly for people who had suffered under them. But at the same time, there was something just shocking, truly shocking, about seeing them being killed. And it was a summary execution. They were literally put up against a wall and shot. So I can remember vividly in this sketchy footage, very brief, the 2 of them, Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu, and they were old. They weren't completely aged, but they were in their early 70s, and they looked old and frail. Ceausescu, a few days earlier, Nicolae, the dictator, had famously appeared on a balcony of the presidential palace in Bucharest to address the crowds that had gathered there, and to his astonishment, to his bafflement, rather than cheering, as they had been always encouraged, forced to do, they jeered him, they hissed him, they booed him, they bayed at him. And that footage has been much seen, including by me. The look on his face, which is just bemusement. He looks not terrified, although he does look scared, but just baffled. He looks like a baffled old man. He fled the balcony, he was captured, and just a few days later, he was shot. And just before he was shot, there is footage of him looking around, and his wife, Elena, looking around. Again, looking, this time, absolutely terrified, but also baffled. Do we in the footage then see the shooting? I'm not sure if I've imagined that or not, but definitely we see the bloodied bodies on the ground, covered with some kind of tarpaulin. These frail old people, riddled with bullets, lying there for dead. It's a horrifying event. It's a terrifying event, though even then I could understand, and I was a student who, I think if you'd asked me then, and actually if you asked me now, would just say capital punishment is wrong under all circumstances. Certainly the queasiness that I felt then, I would feel now if I saw it. A horrifying event, but also clearly an event that made a certain kind of brute, raw political sense. The monsters, the dictators, are lying dead on the ground. Is that justice? I don't know, but it's something. The second execution, or execution event, also happened, in this case, just after Christmas, the 30th of December, 2006. That was the execution of Saddam Hussein. And again, I have a memory of the footage. This was filmed on a phone. This was a more, in its way, formal occasion. The execution of the Ceausescus was just a summary event. This one had been designed to look like a process or a procedure. It was the culmination of a long trial, and I will be talking later on in this series about the trial of Saddam Hussein. On the 30th of December, in a tent of some kind of cavernous hall on an Iraqi army base, he was marched to his death by hanging. He'd asked to be executed by firing squad. That was denied to him. There was an audience, a crowd, quite a large crowd of people, and it included some of his victims, members of families or tribes who had been the victims of his terrible, murderous regime. And though this had been set up by the Iraqi authorities and with presumably the connivance of the American authorities who were still in charge of Iraq, this had been set up to look like some kind of legal process, though it was an execution. The crowd were baying for blood. There were members of the audience who were jeering and hissing and calling out, catcalling at this man. Reading about it afterwards, it became clear that they were shouting, among other things, at him, "Go to hell." Unlike the Ceausescus, Saddam in this footage, though he's just as old a man, I think he was 69, he doesn't look as old. And I don't know if the word is courage, but he is holding himself together. And he walks to his death with some kind of self-possession, which was denied for whatever reason, including presumably the just terrible circumstance, to the Ceausescus. Maybe Saddam was just a braver man. And again, reading about it afterwards, it is said that he replied back to the baying crowd, "This is hell. You mean the hell that is now Iraq, i.e. the hell that you and the Americans have made of my country." Do we see the actual moment that he drops and his neck is broken? In this footage, I don't know, but this was the age of the internet. This isn't something I think I saw on the BBC, so it's perfectly possible. In this case, the really stark contrast between the brutality of the event, the baying crowd, the bloodlust, there was bloodlust in that cavernous room, and the formality of it, judges, people leading him, there was a process, there was some kind of sequence to be followed. People, including Saddam himself, kept breaking through the process. But there were also people clearly trying to hold the process, the procedure in place. And that tension between raw, brutal politics and violence, and in all politics there is the possibility of violence, and process, procedure, the attempt to keep things going the way they're meant to go. Though these are extreme events, there is something of that in all political trials. And there was even something of that in the case of the Ceausescus, because the Ceausescus, for all the fact that they were shoved up against a wall and shot, were given a trial. It was, to be honest, not much of a trial. It was a military tribunal summoned very, very quickly. The outcome was a foregone conclusion. The charges were drawn up equally quickly, and they were scattergun charges. These people were terrible people, and they had done a version of these things, but there wasn't time for real process or procedure, so they were accused of genocide. A number, I think, of 60,000 was conjured up out of nowhere. No one had any evidence that that was the number. They were accused of embezzlement, of corruption, of despoiling the state, of destroying its infrastructure. It was just They were accused of everything. But they were given a lawyer. On Christmas morning in 1989, a leading Romanian defense lawyer, and we are still talking about Ceausescu's Romania, so I'm not completely sure what that means, because Ceausescu's Romania was not a society in which you would have great expectations of a fair trial if there was any politics involved. Nonetheless, a leading defense lawyer was apparently rung up while he was having Christmas breakfast with his family and told, "We would like you to defend the Ceausescus." And apparently he said, "Well, that's a challenge. When's the trial?" "Now." So he was rushed over to the place where the tribunal was taking place, and he was given 10 minutes with his clients. There's not a lot you can do in 10 minutes. He gave them, I presume, what's the only advice you can give people in those circumstances, which he more or less said, you need to plead insanity. You've got to throw yourself on the mercy of the court. I don't think anyone had any expectation it would work, but there's no other defense available to you. You're just going to have to say, you're insane. Maybe he could have added, and you do look like a pair of confused and frail old people. Even if it's just an act, maybe that act is your only hope of salvation. But the Ceausescus refused. Under no circumstances were they going to plead insanity to this kangaroo court, this jumped-up tribunal. They did what tyrants, what dictators, what kings, what queens often do under these circumstances, and we'll be hearing about a lot of this in some of the trials I'll be talking about in this series. They refused to acknowledge the authority of the court. How dare you accuse us of these things? Who are you? This is our state. This is our country. You can't try us. We can try you. It's like that line in Shakespeare's Coriolanus, when they banish Coriolanus and he screams at the Roman people, "I banish you. You don't get to banish me." In that case, Coriolanus got his revenge. In this case, it wasn't going to work, but nonetheless, they refused the advice of their lawyer. And in the end, this trial was clearly a farce. One of the things that happened is, having refused the advice of their lawyer joined forces with the prosecution and joined the attack on them. So whatever happened in those few hours, it ended up with their lawyer siding with the prosecution to list the charges against them. The result was announced. They were told they had been found guilty and they were going to be executed. Formally, under Romanian law, they were given the right to appeal. So they had the right to appeal this verdict. And within minutes, they had been taken outside, put up against a wall, and shot. So that right to appeal was moot. It wasn't much of a trial, but it was a trial. After all, if they were going to take them out, put them up against a wall and shoot them, why bother with a trial at all? The answer is because there always needs to be some process, however brutal the politics, however extreme. There is always going to be some interplay, some tension, some possibility of a genuine fight between force, violence, the people with the guns, and the people who say, but this is how we do it. This is the procedure. Even Ceausescu, farcically, completely hollow offer, was given the right to appeal. There are even more farcical versions. So one I'm thinking of, which is not real footage. It's an imagined version. It's a fictitious take on a real event in a completely brilliant film about power politics, which does play it for laughs. So this is power politics as farce. Armando Iannucci's amazing film, The Death of Stalin, which is about the circumstances surrounding the death of Stalin, but it's particularly about the circumstances that led to the fall of Stalin's henchman, Beria, Lavrentiy Beria, one of the worst human beings who ever lived. That is a hotly contested title, but he might be number one. He might be the worst human being ever. A murderous, sadistic, psychopathic, sociopathic, I don't know, monster, actual monster, human monster, a killer, a torturer, a raper of young girls. There are no words. But Armando Iannucci plays it for laughs. And the death of Beria, which in this film is really telescoped, so in reality, he fell, he was arrested and captured, but he was also given a trial. But it was many months later. It was another one-day trial, like the Ceausescu's trial. The result was a foregone conclusion, but it didn't all happen on the same day. In the film, it happens on the same day. And his fall is depicted as him being dragged out, literally kicking and screaming, biting and spitting, as a group of men in suits and then some other men in guns physically grab hold of him. They pull him out of the room in which he has been trying to exercise his power. They drag him outside. They hold him down. In this version, they almost try and arrange a charge sheet against him, but he's biting and bucking and kicking, so they eventually put a bullet in his head, and then they burn his body. But the farcical element of it, the humor in it, is that arrest of Beria, and this is true, happened in a committee meeting. And we're shown in the film The Death of Stalin, the fight in the committee meeting over the agenda. Beria is trying to assert his authority, and his rivals, including Malenkov and Khrushchev and others, are trying to make it clear to him that his time is up. And again, in the film, but I believe this is also true, there was a button in the committee room. This is the Central Committee of the USSR, which, if pressed, will summon soldiers outside, including Zhukov, the great soldier hero of the Red Army. He will come in and deal with Beria. But the question is, when do you press the button? And you can see in this film version the struggle that's going on to somehow press the button at the right moment when procedure has been established, when it is clear that Beria does not have control of the agenda. There is a bureaucratic fight that goes on simultaneously to, directly alongside, the most brutal kind of raw power politics. And yes, the men outside have guns, but the men in the room who are sitting there in suits are going to end up physically grabbing each other, clawing at each other's faces, trying to assert their authority by sitting on each other, pinning their rivals down in their chairs. And at the same time, there is still simultaneously this process going on, which is process, agenda, the proper order of these things. Who's in charge of the meeting? Who's the chair? What are the rules? Every bureaucratic committee, however brutal, needs rules or it's not a committee. What are the rules here? And that fight plays out alongside the other one. And it does raise the question, if this is going to be just raw, brutal power politics, and it's going to involve someone pressing a button and summoning the hero of the Red Army, who will have enough weapons to make sure that in the end, Beria gets a bullet in his head and then is burned. If that's how this politics is going to play out, why does it matter who's in charge of the agenda? Why do the rules matter? Why, in the reality, was even Beria given a trial? Beria, in his trial, wasn't even given a defense lawyer. Beria, before his trial, no doubt, had been tortured. Nothing about Beria's trial is anything like, not even close, to a process or a procedure that one would recognize as having the legitimacy of a court of law. And yet, the motions are still gone through. Even that thin veneer of legitimacy has to be affected, has to be attempted, though it's a farce. In the Armando Iannucci version, literally a farce. It's like a West End farce. It's like Vladimir, where are your trousers? But it ends with a bullet in the back of the head. And the answer, in a way, is straightforward. Why do the men with guns do this? Because even they understand that raw, brute, coercive politics is chaos. Once you go down the route where it's nothing but who gets to hold whom down in a chair, if that's all politics is, it's chaos, it's carnage. There is no rhyme or reason to it. And nobody wants that, including the dictators, the tyrants, the people with power. Even in this extreme version, and most versions are not as extreme as this, the people with the raw power still want either the fig leaf or more than the fig leaf of legitimacy, of process, of showing that this isn't just violence. This isn't just us asserting our ability to do these things. This is us also asserting the fact that we can do these things because we are the people who follow process or procedure. Even if it's procedure that we've created, we still do it by those rules. And yet, those people also know that as soon as you take one step, just one step down that path, never mind a few steps, you are a tiny bit at the mercy of the procedure, the process. You are saying this is not just raw violence. There are rules here, and if there really are rules, if there really are things that limit the power of violence, then the power of violence is limited by something, and that thing will have a hold on this process. Even if all the hold is, in the end, is that afterwards people can see that it was a farce. Even if that's all it is, even if there's a knock-on effect, which probably is true in the Ceausescu case, the trial didn't do much except to show that these people were trying to create a veneer of legitimacy, and when it was discovered just how thin that veneer was, it probably did them no favours. Even that means that something else is going on here beyond just put them up against a wall and shoot them. And that something else is rule-based order of some kind or another. And these are the extreme cases in most cases of political trials, including the trials of kings as well as tyrants, kings and queens, but also of all sorts of political figures within political systems. The fact that the people with the power nonetheless also want process, sometimes genuine due process, sometimes a real trial, sometimes a trial in front of a jury, sometimes a trial in front of a jury that hasn't even been stitched up in advance. When that happens, there is always the possibility that the process will bite the people who want to exercise the power. It will genuinely constrain them. It will surprise them. It might even be turned against them. It might be that by seeking legitimacy for actions of coercion, the coercion becomes impossible. It might be that the accused is acquitted, that the plea of insanity is heard, or, more likely, that the charge that the court is not a legitimate court, that, having gone down the road of procedure, someone else skillfully is able to show that this isn't the right procedure. There is a better procedure. There is a more established procedure. There is a traditional procedure. A lawyer who does a better job than the Ceausescu's lawyer because that lawyer is given more time and not just a hopeless case. Or maybe it's simply that the person in the dock, having been found guilty, and this will be the case in a number of the trials that I'm going to be talking about, nonetheless uses the fact that in this process there is the right of the condemned person or the person who has been convicted and is about to be taken away and imprisoned to make a speech. And those speeches often live far longer than the outcome of the trial. But there's more to it than that. It's possible to go further than that. Sometimes what happens, in fact, in some ways, in each of these cases, at least a part of what happens, is that the political system finds itself on trial in the struggle to find the relationship between coercion and rule, between violence and the limitations on violence that come with a set of processes or procedures or legal arrangements. In that contest, sometimes the tables are turned, and what ends up happening in the trial, and this can be irrespective of whether the person who is on trial or the people who are on trial are convicted or acquitted, and it can happen when they are convicted, for sure, it ends up that the perception of the procedure is to have been to put politics on trial, to put the people who initiated the procedure on trial, to put the people who came up with the rules that underpin the procedure on trial. This will be a different kind of trial. It may be a trial in the court of public opinion. It may be a trial in the court of history. It may have very immediate dramatic effects in the sense that if the trial is perceived as a farce, the tables can be turned very, very quickly, and suddenly, even though it has produced the desired outcome for those who initiated the process, they end up the ones who are the losers, weakened by it. They may even lose power because of it. All of these things can happen in any of these cases, no matter how well set up the process is, because there is always a tension, almost an inevitable dilemma. If you set it up so that you can be 100% sure that the outcome that the people with brute power, the people with guns, want to happen, the people who have the machinery of the state at their disposal want to happen, if those people can sleep easy at night because they know, no question, the outcome of this procedure will be what they want, it will not achieve its desired effects because it will be seen to be a stitch-up, to be a farce. So they will do things that just try and suggest that it's not completely fixed, it's not a completely foregone conclusion. And once you start to do that, you open the space, maybe not for a different outcome, but you at least open the space for people to start asking, well, what is the real process here? What is the real procedure here? What is really going on? If it's done skillfully, You can have a trial that is a foregone conclusion but looks like it's not a foregone conclusion. But that is a very, very difficult act to pull off, and it's very rare to encounter such trials. Much, much more common is to encounter trials where, in that process of trying to get the balance right between the thing that you want to happen, the person in the dock will be taken away and condemned in one way or another. And the other thing that you want to happen, that people will think that wasn't always going to happen, in that tension, all sorts of things can happen. In fact, I would say in any political trial, a trial which clearly at some level is motivated along with the desire for process by something which can be understood in terms of a contest between forces within a political system. It can be a brute contest, a contest of violence and coercion, or it can be a different kind of contest, a democratic contest, a contest between political parties, but a contest for power. Any courtroom proceeding of whatever kind in which it is clear there is a contest for power going on behind it, at least four things are happening. One is the contest, the assertion of power in one form or another. And there will usually be in that contest someone whose power is weak, is limited. And that person will usually, not always, but usually be the person in the dock. And someone else who has the control, ostensibly at least, who has the ability to exercise the instruments of power, to pull the levers, the machinery of government. That will always be going on somewhere. At the same time, there will always be process and procedure. There will always be the arguments about what is allowed here, what is allowed in this room, in this courtroom, what is allowed in that cavernous building on that army base in Iraq. Are you allowed, when someone is being led to their death, to scream abuse at that person? Why is nobody stopping this? Where are the authorities in the room? Who has authority in this room? Is it the judge, or is the judge actually the stooge of the people outside? Does the jury really have the ability to judge this for themselves? Who's decided on the evidence? Who's decided on the charges in the case of the Ceausescus? Those charges were, on the one hand, understandable, and on the other hand, absolutely absurd. They had no bearing in anything that one would recognize as a legal process. So who's doing that? All of that is in play too. And then within that contest, both sides will also often find themselves appealing to a higher authority. Morality, say, rules beyond mere legal procedure. A political trial might end with the procedure having been followed, the accused having been convicted, and the accused standing in the dock and appealing to a set of rules or ideas or understandings that exist outside the courtroom. Public opinion, morality, religious authority, history, all sorts. But so might the people who are the ones who initiated the process. They might also invoke at some point within or outside the process higher authority. In the Ceausescu's case, the higher authority of expediency. Actually, after the event, the people who initiated that trial said the reason we had to do it so quickly, no real time for a legitimate defense, is that we're in the middle of a revolution. This is what revolutionaries often say, and they're often right. We haven't got the time for actual process, so we have to do the best we can, and this was the best we could do, because if we don't kill this guy, the forces that still support him might marshal themselves and give us a much harder time, and there may be many more victims. The justification of expediency is a very, very powerful one, but expediency is not process. And then there's also chance in any legal proceedings, in any courtroom. Things happen in the room that weren't expected. Things happen outside the room that weren't expected, that change the course of any courtroom drama. The lawyer plays a blinder, finds by chance, in the movie versions of great legal dramas usually have moments like this. Something unexpected happens. There's a gift from the gods, some piece of evidence emerges, or not from the gods, but someone intervenes and finally reveals the key piece of evidence. But it can be much more prosaic than that. Someone gets sick. Someone loses their mind. The jury has a day in which the dynamic of the jury just shifts. It may have nothing to do with what's going on in the courtroom. It may be about personalities. It may be about temperament. It's stiflingly hot in the courtroom. It's freezing cold. Any of these things could happen. And there is always, once you go down that road, once you go down the road, not of just up against a wall and shot, but before we do that, we need to do this thing. And usually this thing will last longer than a day. Usually it will be drawn out. Usually there will be all sorts of things that have to be done so that it looks like more than just a sham or a farce. And once you start doing those things have within them the power to be unpredictable. There is something unpredictable about process, which is that as you go through the process, something might surprise you about the process, about the people who are trying to enact the process, or simply about the dynamic of the human beings who are interplaying around the process. Sitting in committee rooms is boring. Following procedure is boring. Anyone who's done it knows that an agenda is not an exciting document. But anyone who has ever spent any time in any kind of committee that has real power will know there's also within that interminable turning of the wheels of procedure always the possibility of startling things happening. People doing things you'd never expect them to do. My experience of this is so prosaic, but I have sat in boring committee rooms in committees that for years have done what they're meant to do and nothing dramatic has happened. And then suddenly you look around and you realize this person is crying, this person is screaming, this person looks like they're going to have a heart attack, and this person is about to hit somebody. It can happen anywhere. It can happen at any time. And this to me is the fascination of political trials. You could say this is the fascination of any trial. So I use that phrase, courtroom drama. There are lots of different kinds of courtroom drama. A good murder trial makes for a great film, often, great TV, a great book, great books of reportage written about trials, because they all have this dynamic at play. It doesn't have to be something that we would recognize as clearly motivated by or a reflection of big contests of political forces within a society. It can simply be the case of someone accused of a crime and did they or didn't they do it. But within that dynamic, those four things are at play. There are the motivations of the people who are trying to get what they think of as justice, and this is often a contest of wills and of force. Victims, lawyers, prosecutors. There is also the process, there is the procedure, which will bite, it will hold them in. Their desire for vengeance is held in place by this thing that they cannot be sure will deliver what they want. There is always the possibility of the appeal to the things outside of the courtroom, and there is chance, there is opportunism, there is randomness in any trial. But political trials are particularly fascinating, I think, because all of these things are often laid out much more clearly. In a way, it's easier to see through the process to what lies behind it, but it's also sometimes easier to see the ways in which the process itself is power. It has the ability to arrest what is going on, to invert it, to put the political system on trial, to show that the people who are trying to use law as a veneer are actually exposing themselves in the act of putting on the fig leaf. When you see it's a fig leaf, you can't help but imagine what lies behind it. All of that goes on in political trials. And I think a word for this is a word that I'm going to borrow because it's come to acquire a very specific meaning, which I'll talk about in a second. But I think a good word for this is lawfare, because it is that conjunction of law and warfare. It captures that sense that in these events, often drawn out events, sometimes very brief events, the full range of them, military tribunals, jury trials, big courts, small courts, public courts, private courts, impeachments, treason trials, all of it. In all of these events, there is an interplay of what we would recognize as something more like war, that is, the raw contest of political forces exercising their ability to coerce people with guns. Even in democratic political systems, behind the whole thing, someone has the ability to force the issue if they have to. But if you force the issue in a democratic society, you always run the risk of people saying, that's not democratic. So there's that going on, force, and there's law going on, lawfare, that interplay between process, legitimacy, appeals to legitimacy, and the ability to force the issue. But actually, the term lawfare is a relatively recent coinage, and it's only really come into wide circulation maybe in the past couple of decades. So I want to use it to describe the whole history of what I'm going to be talking about in this series, all the way back to Socrates, the trial of Socrates, a kind of lawfare. But the way it's used now, it's much more recent and much more specific. It's come to have two kinds of meaning, I think. So one is it originated to describe what people noticed at the end of the 20th century, the beginning of the 21st, in conditions of war, under circumstances of war, particularly wars between very unequal kinds of forces, maybe between big military powers, imperial powers, and insurgent groups, or people in a society who are fighting for certain kinds of rights without any recourse to military force of their own. For those people on the receiving end of what looks like military coercion, to try to use the courts to push back, to try to use the increasing scope and reach of international law, international criminal courts, the possibility of certain kinds of tribunals to give the people in military contests who lack military power another kind of power. So lawfare came to describe essentially trying to get the people with guns into court as a way of trying to hold or limit their ability to do whatever they like with you. That's one version of lawfare, and it reflects the growth through the second half of the 20th century and into the 21st century of various kinds of legal settings in which what happens in war can be put on trial. A process that doesn't start with the Nuremberg trials, something else I'll be talking about in this series, but certainly almost all of it comes after that. And then more recently still, lawfare has come to have another kind of meaning. So it really does now get bandied around a lot in a highly politicized way to describe what is seen as the use by people in power, particularly in democratic societies, to use the courts to silence their opponents. It came up a lot during the various trials of Donald Trump. His supporters called it lawfare. The recent trial of Marine Le Pen, the term lawfare in the English-speaking world got bandied around a lot. It gets used a lot in Latin American politics, in Brazil, where there's probably a longer tradition of this, of the people in power trying to get their opponents silenced in some way, maybe disqualified from standing for election in a more extreme version, which could have happened to Trump but didn't, jailed so that they can't stand for election. But the people who call it lawfare are trying to say it's a veneer, it's a trumped up version of the legal process, because it's clear what's going on here isn't actually the rule of law. What is going on here is raw politics. And so when people accuse the other side of lawfare, essentially what they're saying is we can see through the legal part of this to the warfare that lies behind it. You are persecuting us. You are using the power at your disposal to come after us. And we've seen through it, so we're going to call it lawfare. And we know why you're doing it. You're doing it because we now live in societies where if you can do it through the courts, that would seem to legitimate it. And by calling it lawfare, we are refusing to legitimate it. So if this jury decides this, and this judge decides that, and if our person, our man, our woman, our hero ends up disqualified, jailed, struck off, facing impossible fines, whatever it is, we're going to call it out for what it is. It's a fig leaf. So those are the two ways lawfares come to be used. And both of them are highly politicized. And you could almost say one is kind of coming from usually, not always, but usually from the populist right, the defenders of Le Pen or Bolsonaro or Trump, but not always. It can be the defenders of Lula in Brazil and others. But it tends now to be associated with, let's just call them the defenders of populists wanting to charge the authorities, the people who are always harping on about the rule of law and about due process and about how this is how we do things in this state and this society. We don't saber rattle and rabble rouse. We do process. And the populists are saying, you call it process, I call it lawfare. And then on the other side, for the people who are trying to use the courts, the criminal courts, the tribunals that might limit the ability of military powers to do their worst. Again, I hesitate to generalize here, but it kind of comes from a sort of humanitarian left, at least in the sense that these two versions of lawfare are going to be themselves butting heads. There isn't going to be agreement between these two sides about what lawfare really is, because one of them is trying to legitimize the law bit in order to constrain the warfare bit, and the other one is trying to delegitimize the law bit in the name of this being raw politics. But I think if you go beyond that recent fight over this new term, this neologism, and just think about the term itself, that's what this series is going to be about. Lots of different varieties of it from all political sides and angles under a very wide range of political systems, some democratic, some completely autocratic, some unquestionably tyrannical, some possibly just or fair, most not. There's very few instances in a political trial of something where you might want to say, well, that was clearly just justice in action. Even the ones where monsters, true monsters, end up getting their just desserts. There is always something more going on, and the more that's going on is lawfare. One could also say, if you really want to expand the reach of this term, that once it gets beyond its specific recent application, it could also be applied just to war itself. So this tends to be applied to what happens when raw politics plays out in a courtroom. But at the same time, if you just turn it around, something similar always happens when raw politics is raw politics in war, in the sense that you could say, alongside lawfare, there's always war law as well. War is not just an anarchic thing. War is not just something where there are no rules and the people with the most guns win. Even when the people with the most guns win, it's never just that. There are always legitimacy claims. There are always rules. Even the most brutal kinds of war have rules. They may not be formal rules. They may not be even conventions. They may just be understandings of what it is to be a heroic person, the rules of Homeric warfare. Everything has rules, no matter how brutal, violent, and anarchic it seems. So in war, those four things that I talked about happening in a political courtroom drama will also be at play. In war, there will be violence and coercion and political forces lining up against each other. In war, there will be rules. There will be the rules of war. They may be weak, they may be thin, they may be nothing more than a fig leaf, but they will be there, and they can be identified. There will also be higher rules than just the rules of war that happen to exist at this time or have been formalized in this place or informalized in that place. There will be appeals to history and morality and expediency and all of the rest. And there will also be chance and chaos. When political forces line up on the battlefield, not in the courtroom, but on the battlefield, and people are aware that this is an event, for all of its raw violence, that has rules. You can do this, you can't do that. You may do the thing that you can't do, but you will be aware that you can't do it. You may execute the people that you have captured, even though they are safely behind your lines. You'll be aware you're not meant to do that. And there will be the appeals to higher rules, morals, authority. There will be the speeches that are made, and there will be the chaos, the fog of war, the little events that turn out to be the thing that decide the battle. All of these things will be in play. So you could call it war law, or you could call it something else, but it's the other side of the same coin. So I'm not claiming that the things that happen in political trials are uniquely an example of the interplay of force, rule, morality, and chance. Everything, even personal affairs are probably the interplay of force, rule, morality, and chance. But I would say this. First, there's enough about war out there. War gets all the attention. There are enough podcasts about war and warfare. Sometimes when I look at what podcasts are out there, I think, is there really room for another podcast about the Second World War? And it turns out there always is. So I don't feel that that is an underserved market. But there probably are, I haven't found them, there probably are podcasts that specialize in telling the story of political trials because there are podcasts about everything. But it seems to me it's a relatively neglected aspect, at least compared to the interplay of those forces on the battlefield. And the courtroom is its own kind of battlefield, the lawfare battlefield. And the other thing I would say is it's just completely compelling. Starting to read about some of these trials, it's fascinating just how much variety there is within that template. How much variety there is within a template which also keeps repeating itself. You see these procedures playing out time and time again. You see the same mistakes being made. You see the tyrants thinking they will get away with it. You see the Democrats thinking that they will get away with it. And by the Democrats, I'm not talking about a political party, it's small d Democrats. And you see it across all of these different historical periods and historical settings and historical circumstances in peaceful societies, in revolutionary societies, in societies that are in flux, in societies that don't know what kind of societies they are. All of them have versions of this. And so that's what this series is going to be about. It's going to try and tell through a series of courtroom dramas, not always necessarily literally in courtrooms, but usually legal proceedings which are clearly political. I'm going to stretch the meaning of political to include some trials you might not think are political. The Lady Chatterley Lover court case, the O.J. Simpson trial. Most of them, I hope you will see, are clearly political, and some of them brutally political. I'm not going to talk about the trial of Nicolae and Elena Ceausescu because I don't think there's much more to say than I've said already, but I am going to be talking about the trial of Saddam Hussein, which was an extraordinary event, and it revealed a lot about all sorts of different contesting claims for the legitimacy of political systems, including the legitimacy of the Americans who had occupied Iraq. What were they doing there? All of this has all of that in it. Right across the range, I would say the history of political trials, the history of lawfare, all political life will be revealed. If you would like to hear the bonus episode that we have just put out, in which I try, you can judge for yourselves whether I succeed, but I try and answer some of the questions that we've had about Trump and globalization and what the hell is going on with the global order in 2025. It's available now on PPF Plus. You can sign up by clicking on the link in the show description. Go to our website, ppfideas.com. You will get that bonus episode. You will get all of our previous bonus episodes, including all of the bonuses that we put out to accompany our Revolutionary Ideas series. You will get all of the forthcoming bonuses for our series Politics on Trial, and listening will be ad-free. Next time on Politics on Trial, which is the name that we're giving to this series, I'm going to be talking about an event that we've touched on in previous episodes of PPF, but have never gone into in much detail. And I really want to go into the detail now. It is perhaps the most famous, the most infamous political trial of them all. It took place in a democracy. It was the trial of a philosopher. It was the trial of Socrates. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.